evening, everyone. My name is Taryn Gilliam, Branch Group Administrator for the Fulton County Public Library System. It is my pleasure to welcome you this evening as we discuss this story, which is part memoir and part call to action of our modern day democracy. We're Better Than This by Congressman Elijah Cummings is a retrospective on his life lessons, and career of one of our country's most inspirational politicians. Cummings and his collaborator, James Dale, offer us a revealing chronicle of the formative moments in Elijah's life that enabled a child of a sharecropper and preacher to rise to the uppermost levels of government. In the book's final chapter, written by Elijah Cummings' wife, Dr. Maya Rockeymoore Cummings, we are taken through his final days and final messages to us, which turned out to be both painful and vital as we face our greatest test as a nation since the Civil War. We're Better Than This reminds people that our vote is the most powerful weapon that we have. And with that being said, I'd like to welcome our guests, Mr. James Dale and Dr. Maya Rockeymoore Cummings.
Thank you so much, Taryn. It's a pleasure to be here with you, the Fulton County Library System. We are delighted that you have selected this book and us to have this discussion today. And I can't tell you how incredible your timing is because today is the last day of the impeachment trial on the Senate side. And so, you know, our US senators, which include 2 new Democratic senators from the state of Georgia, are busy considering the evidence about what happened on January 6th, 2021. But before we get there, I just want to say that my late husband and the late Congressman John Lewis were great friends. And so I know that just as Baltimore misses the leadership of Elijah Cummings, Georgia and the greater Atlanta area misses the leadership of John Lewis. So with that, you know, I married Elijah, you know, in 2008, but we were friends since, you know, 2000 and knew each other for a long time. And, you know, it was, you know, an incredible honor and privilege to be his wife. That being said, several years into our marriage, I started encouraging him to write a book because he had so many stories, so many great stories. Just a few of them are in the book. He had more. And I felt like people should hear his life's trajectory and some of these incredible stories that helped to shape his life and career. And so, you know, I started looking around for someone to help him write it and went through several iterations before actually sitting down to lunch with a friend who said that she had the perfect person for me, someone who happened to be a good friend of hers who did this work, and this is what he does. And his name was James Dale. And so I was introduced to Jim, and you know, we had a great conversation. I introduced him to Elijah, they hit it off. And you know, I can't tell you how many people who have read this book said, who knew Elijah, say to me, you know, I hear his voice when I'm reading it. I hear him speaking to me as I'm reading it. And so I think that that's a testament to the incredible skill and talent of Jim Dale. And with that, I would like to welcome Mr. Jim Dale.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Maya. And we're delighted to be here. We're honored, and it is a very special time. And it's very special to be talking to the folks in Georgia at this time, as Maya said. And the writing of this book, as she said, you know, I've been writing books like this in a collaborative way, co-author, for many years with people, interesting people. I've been fortunate to work with really some great people. But I would say without any hesitation that of all the people and all the experiences that I have had in collaboration, there's none that measure up to this experience. It was personally, the project, the work was the most meaningful an indelible experience in my writing life. It had an impact on me every single day that I worked on it. And I'm not putting down any other books I wrote. It just that this was something extraordinary. And I knew it almost from the beginning. We talked and met frequently. And session after session, Elijah would tell me stories. And from those stories, I began to formulate a structure for the book. As you referred to it earlier, as part memoir and part call to action. We didn't call it that at the time. We sort of called it a fabric. We were quilting an interweaving of formative stories from his youth, from growing up, from his family, from the values he learned at home, from what he went through in school, with taking those formative stories and interweaving them with current day, modern day, real-time events that were happening in his life, in government, in Washington, and representing Baltimore and in Washington. And we interwove them because it became apparent very soon that almost everything he did, almost every decision he made, every stance he took was somehow informed by a value or a story that came from 20 years ago or 40 years ago or 50 years ago or 60 years ago. They just would keep surfacing. And that became a structure that we used, and it was really quite beautiful as a structure. And I would sit with him and he would tell me stories. I'd pull stories out, I'd ask questions. Very early in our writing sessions, I asked Elijah what I referred to later as an unfair question, which is, of all these stories that you've told me, is there one that perhaps rises above the rest, that stands out as being the most formative in your life? And without any hesitation, he said, yes, there is one. And he recounted the experience that I'm going to now, that became a story that I'm going to read an excerpt from now. When I was no more than 11 years old, my life was forever altered. I certainly didn't realize it at the time. I knew something important was happening, but it took a long while before the impact really hit me. We had a neighborhood community playground center where the kids would gather in the summer with a small wading pool and some recreation counselors to watch over us. Our little wading pool was no more than a few feet across and very shallow, maybe up to your knees, and filled with kids, side by side. You had to take turns a half hour at a time, and after the third group, the water was pretty dirty. But that was the only way we had to get cool on a hot day. One day in late August, a lady came by and asked the kids, how would you like to go to a real swimming pool, one with a diving board, an Olympic-sized swimming pool? Well, we all thought that would be great, but how is that going to happen? She said there was a pool like that only a few blocks away from where we were in Riverside Park, and that we deserved to go there. And she was going to take us. She said, quote, you can swim to your heart's delight. Her name was Juanita Jackson Mitchell. That was almost 50 years ago. Swim to your heart's delight. I remember those words. And she said, we thought that to us, she was just this nice lady who was going to take us to a real swimming pool. We didn't realize until later that she was a civil rights pioneer from a family of civil rights pioneers and the first African-American woman to practice law in Maryland. Juanita Jackson Mitchell's mother was the inspirational Dr. Lily Jackson, who descended from a signer of the Declaration of Independence, but still had to attend the segregated colored high school. She rose to president of the Baltimore branch of the NAACP, became an early leader in nonviolent protest, and she was known as the Mother of Freedom. Her daughter, Juanita, was married to Clarence Mitchell Jr., a national leader in civil rights and lobbyist for the NAACP, and they were the parents of two state senators, Michael and Clarence. Civil rights was practically the family business. What Mrs. Mitchell did not tell us that day about the nice pool she was taking us to was that it was totally segregated, no blacks allowed. She and her colleagues at the rec center, Jim Smith and Walter Black, were leading us on an integration march. There we were, a band of little kids walking down the streets of Baltimore from a black neighborhood to a white neighborhood, only a few blocks from each other, but worlds apart. Day after day, Juanita and Jim and Walter led about 30 of us, walking 10 or 15 blocks, while an angry mob, not of other kids, but of grown white adults, yelled names at us, told us to go home, and threw rocks and bricks at little kids. One of those rocks struck me in the forehead and caused a scar that I carry to this day. The police watched and the newspapers took pictures and ran stories, but nobody stopped the angry residents, and nobody stopped us. We kids would swim in the Riverside Park pool each day and then leave with quote unquote neighbors yelling racial epithets and throwing debris in bottles, and white kids pushing black kids in the pool. I call them neighbors, ironically. Yes, we all lived within blocks of each other, but they were hardly neighborly. They were the opposite, people trying to keep us out of their neighborhood. Tensions were high. After taking Sunday off, they let us all back again on Monday, Labor Day. That day, someone called Walter's associate, Lyle Roberts, a nigger, the hostility escalating. But about that time, the Riverside Park citizens, clinging to their segregated white enclave, must have realized we were all going to just keep coming back, because they stopped coming to their doorways and out into the streets and shouting and throwing rocks. Just as Juanita Mitchell promised, we all got to go to a real pool. And as she said, we swam to our heart's delight. Even as little children, we had a sense of victory and fear. We'd gone off to play every day, but we ended up making history. That was in the early 1960s, and old rules and practices and even prejudices began slowly but steadily to change. Baltimore stayed largely segregated for the next 10 years, but it was the beginning, the root of what would evolve into a massive upheaval in social norms, change. For me, that was the beginning of wanting to become somebody who could make things change. I saw that Mitchell and the other people who made integration happen were lawyers. So I wanted to be a lawyer. These lawyers were young men and women who had the courage to walk up the streets and have people yell at them and be unafraid, to have little kids following them, trusting and believing in them, to make change happen. I wasn't sure what a lawyer was, what their job was, but I saw what they could accomplish. Oh my God, what a powerful force that could be. Change. Little black children getting what only white children had, because we were, after all, just kids, no matter what color, who wanted the same chances in life. The chance to swim in a pool, the chance to go to a good school or live in a nice neighborhood or see a better world. I wanted to be part of that change, and I have endeavored to do so ever since, and I have pursued it ever since. As for progress in achieving change, here's a fitting postscript. 30 years later, a man came up and identified himself as one of those in the angry mob and told me he was sorry. What is the right response to justice acknowledged, but so long delayed? I did not applaud his admission, nor did I spurn it. I said, apology accepted. Now, Elijah said to me as we worked on the book that he never forgot the swimming pool incident. It was formative. He said he often called upon the memory of it to fuel his actions in Washington. When he conducted hearings on the Trump immigration policies, separating mothers and children, putting them in cages, telling them to go back where they came from. When Trump launched his Twitter attack on Cummings' beloved hometown as a, quote, disgusting rat and rodent-infested mess. When Elijah answered ABC's George Stephanopoulos' question, yes, Trump is a racist, no doubt about it. When Elijah walked the streets of Baltimore to calm his city after the senseless death of young Freddie Gray. At Freddie's funeral, when he asked those watching and listening, did you see him? Did you really see him? You see him in the casket and you see him on the news. But when he walked to school, when he played ball on his neighborhood team, when he sang in the choir, did you see him? Elijah Cummings decried the invisible black lives so often lost, never really seen. It's stories like this as the fabric that were the fabric that interwove his life and mission. And now I'm going to turn it back to Maya, who's going to talk to you about that last chapter and about what has occurred since in the times that we faced just in these last couple of years. Maya?
Thank you, Jim. Indeed, that event at the pool was formative because it allowed and showed Elijah what the power of people can do, how the power of people can drive social change, how pulling the levers of the law can transform the lives of people everywhere, especially people who have been left out and left behind. And so Elijah dedicated his life. He started with a country that had turned its back on him as an African-American born into the Jim Crow South. But he rose to become one of the most staunch defenders of democracy because he saw the power of democracy, just like the people of Georgia have seen the power of democracy in this last cycle. So I'm going to read a segment from my last chapter, which I had the privilege to write, and then I'll bring it up to current, basically current events with regards to what's happened since. After the Democrats regained the majority in the midterms, Elijah was the chairman of the Committee on Oversight and Reform. Elijah was finally in a position to lead investigations and to set the agenda for hearings. But he was sober about the realities of the threats he and his committee would face from the Trump administration and congressional Republicans. Despite his pain, he threw himself into his work. Then, in late summer, just before his speech at the National Press Club, he took yet another bad turn and was readmitted to Johns Hopkins. The underlying suspicion was that the cancer had come back. Elijah was weaker than I'd seen him in years. A day before his speech, he was to give the speech, I asked if he still intended to do it. He said, "Maya, I'll be there if I have to crawl." Elijah was so drained that when his aides maneuvered him to the podium, pale and unsteady, I thought he might drop. Then he looked at the crowd 4 or 5 times the size of what had been expected before his investigations into the administration, before the shootings in Dayton and El Paso, and before Trump's Twitter attack on Baltimore and Elijah. He looked at the crowd and you could see him become energized. He exhorted the audience to listen and, more important, to take action. He was passionate as only Elijah Cummings could be. The gathering of usually callous Washington media cheered and gave him a standing ovation. Exhausted and barely able to keep going, he went straight back to the hospital. During the next few weeks, he managed to continue vital work. He was on the phone with Nancy Pelosi, Adam Schiff, Jerry Nadler, and his staff. He read testimony. He reviewed the impeachment updates. He signed subpoenas. So many times I said, "Elijah, that's enough for today." "Okay, I'll stop soon," he'd say. Doctors at Hopkins and NIH monitored his cancer. It was obviously recurring. The question was, could they do anything to slow it down or limit it? We all did everything we could. There became, I think the best word is, an inevitability to it. He knew, and I suspected, we were coming to the end. It was coming as if you could see it like a train approaching in the distance. When you're not sure how far away it is, but you know it's steadily coming toward you. That's when he began to talk differently. He would say he was tired, no matter how much rest he got, just tired all the time. He complained of constant pain. It was clearly physical, but it was also emotional and spiritual. The inner Elijah was burning out. We talked about the past, what Elijah had done, and about the future and all that remained to be done, but we did not use the word death. We just knew. As if sped by his passing, events moved even faster in the days just after Elijah's death. On December 18, 2019, Speaker Nancy Pelosi banged the gavel and announced that the House of Representatives voted 230 to 197, strictly along party lines, to impeach Donald J. Trump, the 3rd president in the history of the United States to face impeachment charges. That evening, during her press conference, she spoke about Elijah. She honored him as a key force in the inquiry, calling him our North Star. And she quoted him, "When the history books are written about this tumultuous era, I want them to show that I was among those in the House of Representatives who stood up to lawlessness and tyranny," end quote. She added. He also said somewhat presciently, "When we're dancing with angels, the question will be, what did you do to make sure we kept our democracy intact?" We did all we could, Elijah. We passed the 2 articles of impeachment. The president is impeached. As I've often told people in the days after his death, Elijah's death wasn't just my loss. It was our loss as a nation. And we all have the responsibility to move his legacy forward, because we know that with every transgression, every disregard for the Constitution, every attempt to act above the law, every denial of truth, our democracy is endangered. That's why in the months and years ahead, we must continue to hear Elijah's voice. We're better than this. We're better than this. Yes, we are, Elijah. We must be. So Elijah's words were indeed very prescient, absolutely more so than we wished. Since his passing, we've lived through basically a whole lot of historical moments. From the first impeachment charges to, the partisan acquittal and the Republicans' refusal to actually convict Donald Trump, to the COVID pandemic and Trump's botched response, which Elijah would not have been surprised about, to a very ugly presidential campaign, and thank God for the election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Certainly to Trump's accusations of a stolen election, and to his supporters, out there repeating that along with the right-wing media. Trump launching outrageous and basically frivolous lawsuits claiming voter fraud. Republican officials joining in on the big lie and going along with the president's election lies. But even, people like Bill Barr and Chris Christie did reject those fraud claims, thank God. And to, of course, the electoral college votes for Biden and Harris, the Republican House of Representative members and some members of the US Senate actually voting not to certify the election results. And certainly what we're talking about in Washington today was the violent insurrection that happened on the US Capitol on January 6th, 2021. With Trump supporters saying that President Trump himself had asked them to come and march on the US Capitol, breaking in and invading the US Capitol and endangering the lives of many people who worked there, including the members of Congress. So what would have Elijah thought? What would he have done? Had his worst fears come to pass? And the reality is that, he would have been out there urging the senators to convict Donald Trump, because he knew that this man was not to be trusted with our democracy. While he did not anticipate he was going to incite an insurrection on the US Capitol, he absolutely did anticipate that this man had a streak of cruelty and a way about him that was violent, that could lead to more human tragedy in the future. And that was one of the reasons why he urged us not to allow him a second term in office. So with that, he would have been absolutely prideful that Kamala Harris, Howard University graduate, somebody who, of course, Elijah was a Howard University graduate, someone he knew, and that Joe Biden, someone he was friends with and also knew, respected, and admired, won. And so he would have taken this moment to express hope that this notion of we're better than this is absolutely an aspirational notion, but it's also something that we should all print on the DNA of every cell of our bodies, because we can only be better than this if we do better. Thank you. I'm going to stop at that point.
Oh, wow. Wonderful. The craftsmanship of this work is simply brilliant. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Dill and Dr. Cummington, to discuss the late Elijah Cummings and We're Better Than This, his political memoir. I'm Forrest, one of the reference librarians, a part of Auburn Avenue Research Library, a special research library, a part of Fulton County Library Systems. But firstly, the nominations for the 52nd NAACP Image Awards were announced. We're Better Than This is nominated for Outstanding Literary Work for Nonfiction and debut author. Congratulations on this wonderful accolade.
Thank you very much.
That's a general thank you. And of course, I'll take a secondary thanks.
Thanks.
Wonderful.
We appreciate it. We did notice in the nonfiction, we're up against this guy, Obama, who has a pretty good track record of these things.
Some guy named Obama, we don't know him.
Really? Well, before we get into Elijah Cummings' legacy in life, the book is a collaborative effort, including the co-authors James Dill and Dr. Maya Rockeymoore Cummings. But truly walk us through the development of this partnership until its manifestation.
Well, I'm going to go back to the beginning because there's no partnership. It doesn't exist until Maya evidently finally convinces him it's time to do the book, because I think from what she told me, that conversation had gone on and off for some time. And so that was really, for me, that was the beginning, but it wasn't the beginning. It had started earlier.
Right. And so, it's just
Collaborate.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I'm listening.
No, it's just fortuitous that everything fell into place with Jim as the collaborator. We found an agent, the book publisher. It was primed and ready to go. So it just literally, I call that God. It's a God moment where everything just comes together in a serendipitous moment.
Wow. Collaborating with Elijah Cummings to write this book is an immeasurable journey and story, different experiences and perspectives coming together beautifully to illustrate Elijah Cummings' life, work, and political legacy. During certain parts of the book, did it ever make you uncomfortable? If so, why did you feel that way? Did it lead you to a new understanding or awareness of some aspect of Elijah Cummings' life you might not have thought of before?
Yeah, almost daily. But I would say, the job, it's not a job I ever designed. You evolve into these things, 20 some years ago, I got started with it, and there's no place to go to school to learn this. So, what the job is to listen to somebody and sort of try to inhabit their mind and their life with the realization that you will never do it perfectly, because you cannot inhabit that body and that mind. So you do your best to do it. And you try to listen, and you listen for patterns, and you listen for ideas. And by definition, you hit on something that I haven't been asked this way, but it's perfect. By definition, there's discomfort, because if I started to do a book with you tomorrow, I have to ask you things that are personal, not just the things you might say on a talk show, when to Joe Scarborough, where you kind of know the question and you know how you're going to respond. Once in a while, you might ad lib something out. But you have to probe into it. You have to ask questions like, what do you mean that you reach across the aisle and you're friends with Republicans on the other side? Is that just one of those things you say because it's a good thing to say? And, it's better to say that than say I'm enemies with everybody. And you have to dig, sort of keep at it and say, well, how do you do it if a person has views that are 180 degrees from you? You have to I had to ask questions about his health or his illness more than once. And that's not something most of us really want to talk about, especially when your health is as delicate. There were so many different things. I spoke to his pastor. But here's the great thing, and then I'll stop. as you're doing this, sometimes people are so happy to open up. They don't even know it. At first, they would, oh, no, I don't know if I'm going to go there. And they start to talk and things start to come out. And I mean, one of the things was I was having a conversation with Elijah and Maya's pastor, and he was talking about their friendship and how they confide in each other. And then all of a sudden he started talking about not their friend. He had talked about that quite a bit. And then he started talking about Elijah and Maya's love. Well, that's something I wanted to know about, but up to that point, probably he hadn't had the guts to ask about. He started talking about this relationship that he saw weekly from where he stood in front of the congregation, and it was great, and it's in the book. So you happen on things, and you have to go where it's uncomfortable, and then try to be polite when you have gone too far, and say, okay, we'll back off, but I'll try to come back to it later. I hope that gives you a little picture.
Wonderful. It does. In the introduction and much of the book, many Elijah-isms depict his distinctive and electrifying tone. How did you build trust to capture his tone and his unique personality?
I got lucky because early in I think I sort of retell it a little bit at the beginning, and I wrote that introduction. I never write an introduction to the books I do because they're not my books. They're someone, it's so-and-so's story. But because he had passed away, the publisher said, the editor said, in this case, we would like you to sort of give us a perspective because he's not here. But that for him to trust me, it's a very good question, because does that principal author trust this stranger? Early on in the second long meeting we had, the question became, we've sort of had these two dates. The question is, are we going to go ahead with this? And he asked me a lot of questions about the process and about co-authors and about timing and about all kinds of things. And so then you get to sort of that point, which is, okay, is it go or no go? And he sort of said, okay, well, what do we do? And I said, whatever you do, you have a great story to tell. There's no shortage of people out there who can do this, who are talented writers, who are good, who are skilled. And you'll find somebody, whether it's me or someone else. The only advice I would give you is make sure you're comfortable talking to that person. Mm. Now, we had been talking at that point 2 sessions that were 2 or 3 hours each. And another one of those moments where he didn't take a breath. He said, I'm comfortable, let's get going. And I say, it's sort of like, that's not what you expect somebody to say, well, let me think about that. I'll get back to you next week. He said, no, go. So he was the measure of the comfort, not me, as it should be.
It sounds as though it was an instant bond. Elijah Cummings gave breathtaking remarks at Freddie Gray's funeral. Elijah Cummings, as you previously mentioned, his "Did you see him?" quote echoes throughout many communities as the rest of the world witnesses social and racial injustices throughout the United States. In a popular quote from Elijah Cummings, he shares, "I used to say our children were messengers to a future we will never see. Now our children are sending us to a future they will never see." How can this book be used as a tool to move us forward from much of the political and social unrest?
You have I believe, a great response to this. Will you take that one?
If you were speaking about something in specific, I'm not sure what it was.
Well, I'm thinking about what you said about, first of all, about the program, with the youth program, and also about his dedication to kids.
Yeah. So, Elijah had 2 objectives for this book. One was to, of course, warn the American people about Donald Trump. But the second, which was really his primary objective, was to inspire young people. To show them that he faced many obstacles growing up, being labeled special education, being, born Black in the Jim Crow South, being poor, and that he was able to, through persistence, hard work, faith, he was able to basically keep going and push and achieve at every level, and rise to become one of the most powerful members of the United States Congress. And so he wanted his story to be an inspiration to youth. So yes, in a way, it is a workbook for young people. It's ironic because there is a young readers edition that's coming out soon as well. And so that will be targeting middle school age young people. But Elijah was passionate about young people, and he viewed adults as it being the responsibility of adults to actually provide a bridge for youth, so that they could actually make the connections and see their way to a future that they couldn't see previously, and have the resources and the capability, the skills, the motivation, and the encouragement to do it. And so, here in Baltimore, he founded a program called the Elijah Cummings Youth Program in Israel. It takes basically inner city youth, African-American kids from across the city. And then they go on a trip to Israel. And then they learn cross-cultural, intercultural, understanding and learning. And then the program gives them technical assistance and support to help them actually tutoring and technical and other supports to help them get through high school and then to go to college. That program has a 100% graduation rate from high school, and it has a 95% graduation rate from college. And they've got more than 20 cohorts now. It's now in its 21st year of operation. And some of those young people, there's a guy named Victor Blackwell. You can see him on CNN as an anchor every Saturday morning. He came out of that program. There are, young people who came out of that program who are running organizations. They are running for office now. They are doing all kinds of magnificent things. And so his legacy is not just in the world of policy and politics, but it's in shaping the lives of young people.
Wow, wonderful. Chapter 6 in the book is also entitled Trump's Twitter Attack on Baltimore, Exploring the Investigation and the Reform of the Administration. The book provides Trump's 12 steps as well that led President Trump Twitter attack on Cummings and also Baltimore during the last months of Elijah Cummings' life. And amidst President Trump's social media attacks, Trump was also battling with health issues privately. Do you consider the internet as a media that amplifies or promotes propaganda or violence? How did the Trump Twitter attack shape Elijah Cummings' final moments in 2019?
So absolutely, yes. We have seen how not just social media, but right-wing media sources, from Fox News to Owen to, Newsmax, to all of the various, outlets that they have, that, it's not just propaganda, it's misinformation, it's disinformation, outright lying. And now we see how, language that's used online can actually, and in person, can incite violence. And so, when Elijah's sustained those Twitter attacks, it's like our lives blew up in the sense that, the pressure was on. There was intense media interest. Whenever Donald Trump actually mentions you in a Twitter feed, that is the signal for all of his followers to begin to harass you. And so we got death threats. There were all kinds of, crazy things going on. We had a break-in here at the house that is still to this day unexplained, but it came just hours before Trump started tweeting about Elijah and the crime in Baltimore. So we felt like it wasn't a coincidence. And so, we were under a lot of pressure and under a lot of stress. And I believe, and Elijah believed, that stress and what Donald Trump did basically took him into a downward spiral and actually ended up, I think, negatively shaping his last days on earth.
He did say, he said in a conversation that I had with him around that time while we were working on trying to shape that incident into a story. And he said, one conversation, he said, "This is going to kill me, or this may kill me." And I said, and I sort of stopped short, and I thought, well, that's an expression we use. Most, we're one of exasperation and exaggeration. And I said, "Really, I know it was difficult." I said, "But what do you mean?" And he said, "I mean, it took so much out of me, it could kill me." Now, of course, what was happening at that time is his illness had really been devastating and was really wreaking havoc. But you think about what someone's attack can do. It isn't a set of words one day. It's the repetition. It's the threat. It's how it becomes hyperbole. It's spread like, like I hesitate to use like a virus, but it's spread and it's devastating. And we've seen what social media can do. Is social media all bad? No, it's not all bad. It's a neutral thing that's been misused. It's a piece of technology, but it's wildly out of control. And we've had the experts in media will tell you that for hundreds of years, they've had proof that for whatever human reason that I don't understand, that lies tend to spread faster and stick more than truth. Well, that's with what we thought of as traditional means of communication. If you then put them on steroids, so to speak, and amp them up, we've seen how fast you can spread disinformation, misinformation, and bad behavior.
Oh, thank you for sharing such beautiful stories. I admire also, Dr. Cummings, your strength. It's truly admirable. From unfavorable hearings, combating fake news, and the impeachment process of the 45th president. In chapter 7, it reads, "When it seems like you can't do anything, do something. Don't say it's too big or too oppressive to overcome. Start, try now." As my grandmother said to me, "Elijah, don't let them make us wait anymore." That's the message we are getting from the people of this country. Don't wait anymore. Do something. You may not get all the way, but you may get somewhere. Dr. Maya Rockeymoore Cummings and Elijah Cummings met on Capitol Hill, a reflection of their passion for equality, following the passing of the Howard graduate. What motivated you, Dr. Cummings, to run to represent for the Maryland 7th Congressional District?
Well, first of all, Elijah told me on several occasions that he thought I'd be good at the job, and I had no reason to disbelieve him. I had been advising members of Congress for a long time. First on the House Ways and Means Committee, working on the Congressional professional staff, then as chief of staff for former Congressman Charlie Rangel of New York. And then I went over to the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. Well, after working at the National Urban League and their think tank, I went to the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, where I ran their research and policy shop and, gave members of Congress all kinds of advice on tactics and policy. So this is something that has been in my blood. It's what I do. And so, if my husband said that I'd be good at it, who was I to question him? And so when he passed, I decided to take a run for it.
Wonderful. At the end of chapter 1, entitled "The Lie and the Lesson," Elijah Cummings passionately mentions his love for you and his life that he shared. The friendship bloomed into a beautiful marriage after your initial meeting. But what is your most uplifting memory during the development of this book with Elijah Cummings?
During the development of the book?
Yes.
I'll pass that to Jim first.
Well, I think that, there were two things going on at once, I think, while we were writing this book. We were all living through some awful times. And they got better, worse before they got better. They got worse. We all had this well, today was terrible. Tomorrow can't possibly be worse than this. And then if we even got a day's respite, well, it was only 2 days, and then it got way worse. it was really remarkable. It was breathtaking. But if there's an uplifting part, I said at the very beginning of this is the most impactful book I've ever worked on because of this man's influence in life. You saw people just rising against the bad stuff, and it would give you a little shred of hope, even on some of the worst days. And I have to say, personally, I often used Elijah, it probably unfairly, at the end of our conversations, where he would just have told me some, horrid story of what was going on and what had been said and what would happen, not only in the hearing, but what he heard, what he got in the prep or lead up to the hearing that might have even been worse. And I would say, well, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future? Because I was feeling, at this point, after he told me the story, like I should just cash it in. It's over, And he would say, and he wouldn't, give me a Pollyanna answer. He'd say, well, it's bad. It's really bad. I've not seen it this bad, but I believe we will prevail. I believe that the democracy will prevail. It's just going to be very, very rocky to get there. And somehow you can take some solace in the idea. If somebody tells you it's going to be really lousy, but we're going to come out the other end, it's much worse than if they say it's going to be really lousy and I don't know what's going to happen. I took some faith in that because I felt like he was a fighter and he was a believer. And so I felt like there were enough good people there doing this that maybe we would survive it. And I think that today, as bad as things are, there's a much greater ray of hope than we've seen in quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it was just terrible. The whole thing was just terrible. I think that the one bright light that I remember from the past 4 years was when the Democrats took back the House, and the day that Elijah actually became chairman of the committee.
Absolutely.
It was just a celebratory time, and he was proud. I was proud of him. And so, it was just a really, I think, just a happy moment.
Yeah.
Wow. Thank you for that. Wow. Sounds like you all shared wonderful moments and times with him. Treasured truly. Before we go to our last question, I want to remind the audience that at the end, you may submit your questions by raising your hand. You have 30 seconds to voice your question, and we'll be sure to answer them. But I wanted to ask, this book includes some intimate stories and family mantras. At the end of the book, Elijah Cummings shares his mother's words of respecting the storm. What did Elijah Cummings mean by those words, those nuggets of wisdom, respecting the storm?
So, there was a story about when he was a kid, there was a storm, they went off to school, they found out later that a friend of theirs had gotten killed, something of, I think, a slick of ice or something, and a car ran him over or something. And his mother later said, and they were like surprised because by the time they got out of school, it was dry outside, and how could anybody possibly get killed by a car sliding on ice? And he took that as a lesson, and it absolutely was a lesson that during the storm you have got to respect it, meaning that if there's ice, you can't be running on ice. If there is lightning, you can't be outside with an umbrella. You have got to take precautions. And if there is a Donald Trump, you can't necessarily be out there, poking at the bear all the time. I'm not going to say ever, but definitely you've got to be careful and cautious. And so Elijah always had this analogy about respect the storm, because you could lose your way in the storm and not make it to the other side. He also had an analogy about, and the objective is to make it through to the other side, to see the daylight on the other side of the storm. But he also used that analogy to say that we have to, when we're in the storm, we've got to prepare for the post-storm. We've got to prepare for the sunlight. And what are we going to do to make sure that there's a better day after the storm?
Beautifully. Thank you for sharing that. Oh, wonderfully. As a reminder, there are also reference resources in the chat that you can come to at any time that will be available on Fulton Public Library, as well as the Auburn Avenue Research Library, official social medias and website. And before we move on to our questions, Mr. Dale and Dr. Cummings, do you have anything you'd like to share before we move forward with our questions?
I think we're happy to take the questions. Maya, you have anything? No?
Nope, I'm happy to take questions as well.
Okay.
Wonderful. Let's see. I don't see any at the moment. I'll wait for a few more moments to see if anyone has any questions before we move forward. Remember, you can raise your hand and you have 30 seconds to raise your question for Dr. Cummings and also Mr. Dale.
I think I'll add a point here while we're waiting to see if we talked earlier. You mentioned earlier about, he said, do something, and not just, even if you don't get all the way. And I think a lot of people have been cynical about this impeachment trial, to say, well, if it's not going to go anywhere, if we're not going to get a conviction, why are we doing it? And I think every day you see, I think we see why it's being done. It may not go. I'm not really ready to give up yet, but it may not go to conviction, but it will have informed people all over the country and perhaps all over the world. First of all, that the democracy still works. And secondly, what this person perpetrated and what his followers perpetrated. It doesn't matter in the end. It does matter, but it doesn't matter totally or solely. That if the conviction doesn't happen, he will have been convicted.
And I also want to add that Elijah talked about the importance of the vote. He told the story about his mother on her deathbed saying, "Do not let them take away our right to vote." And both Elijah Cummings and John Lewis were staunch defenders of the Voting Rights Act and were working to try to restore it, while encouraging African Americans in particular, because we have been almost singled out in the history of this country for exclusionary tactics with regards to the power of our vote. And so with that, you know, he just wanted us as African Americans especially to embrace the electoral process, to embrace this democracy, to embrace the vote, because that is your voice and your power in many respects in the electoral system. And so, you know, that is why I started this conversation by acknowledging Georgians and everything that they did to get Warnock and Ossoff elected. And of course, we've got folks like Stacey Abrams and Latasha Brown and so many powerful sisters and brothers who are working down there to connect with the people and encourage them to vote. Do not give up on that spirit. We've got to continue to build on it and to grow it and to know that it's important for not just the future of our lives, but for our children and their children.
Thank you for that. We have two questions from the audience. The first is, what was his early family life like?
I'm sorry, say it again.
The first question from the audience is, what was his early family life like?
Well, as I say, I know it from the stories, and Maya, you probably have some more stories. Family life was about as important as anything. I mean, it was a constant refrain. As you said earlier, both parents were preachers. Both were descended from sharecroppers or were from families of sharecroppers. He often talked about them being preachers, and he said they didn't just preach on Sunday. That was the life you led in the house. So you were getting lessons, as he said, laughing one day. He said, whether you wanted them or not, every day, that those values that were there were reinforced constantly. And so this was inbred, this was in the air, it was in, you know, so I think that few people are raised with that much of an inculcation of values on a constant basis, whether on times when when times were good and times when times were not so good. That was very, very important. There were other specific values. Education was important. Reading was important. But I think this sense of your duty and what you can accomplish, what is possible to accomplish from two people who really were not able to accomplish a lot, but instilling that idea in him and his siblings, you can, and they did.
You know, it didn't strike me until you were just speaking, Jim, but you know, his father had this saying that if one of his kids missed a day at school, it must have meant that they died the night before, meaning that none of his kids were going to miss school, and none of them did. But it just strikes me, Jim, that, you know, Elijah attending school every day of his formative youthful years set him up to actually continue to work every day while he was actually battling cancer. You know, the whole notion that you had an obligation to, you know, show up and do what you were supposed to do, even if you had other challenges, was driven into him at a young age. He was raised by Pentecostal preachers. He later left the Pentecostal church and went to the Baptist church, but they grew up in a strict family household. But, you know, Elijah's life, his life in Congress, and certainly in the Maryland State Legislature, was an example, I think, of values-based leadership. He led from his values, and it often, I think, encouraged his colleagues to think about the big picture as well.
That leads us to our question from Facebook. What led Elijah Cummings to politics and not the pulpit?
I asked him the question. It so happens that because he talked so much about his parents as preachers, and because his delivery was often, people would often say, you know, that he had that cadence and that booming voice and that presence like a preacher. And so I said one day, well, you know, why did you ever consider going that route? Did you think about it? Why didn't you? And he said, you know, growing up with two parents who were preachers, he said, I believe that a preacher has to be perfect. And then he sort of laughed a little bit. He said, and I am far from perfect. He said, but I can do a lot. So leave that to them. I'm going to sort of be the preacher within the lay world, so to speak.
Wow. Now that is a true nugget of wisdom. We have one more question from the audience. Who inspired Elijah Cummings the most in his life?
Well, Maya, must have been you.
I think I had an influence on him later in life. But I do think that in his early years, certainly his parents, but Martin Luther King, he mentions as an inspiration that he would, on Sundays, he would listen. And you're sitting there at Auburn, library, but, Elijah listened to Martin Luther King's speeches on the radio. And he was inspired by him. He was also inspired by a lot of women who supported him. Juanita Jackson Mitchell, the woman that Jim mentioned earlier, was the first African-American woman to practice law in the state of Maryland. She was the head of the NAACP in Baltimore. She comes from a very prominent political family. And so, she was an inspiration for him. So, Elijah was blessed to have a lot of inspirational people in his life. And I don't want to forget Nancy Pelosi, the current Speaker of the House. Elijah considered her a mentor, and she supported him, and he supported her. He considered her a master strategist, and he respected her to the nth degree.
Yeah. Great.
Beautiful. And our final question for tonight is, can you talk about his love for Baltimore and what that means to the city?
Well, Maya, I think you lived that every day, and I would defer to you if you like. I think you have a good sense of that.
So Elijah loved Baltimore, and he talks about in the book, I think he loved Baltimore as much as you could love a person. And so I'm a person, I lived all over the place. My dad was Air Force. So by the time I graduated from high school, I lived in 9 different places, even abroad. To me, love was the company you keep, your family members, right? You don't necessarily tie it to a space, a geographical space, because that hadn't been my experience. But Elijah grew up smack dab in Baltimore City. It shaped him, it developed him, it supported him, it amplified him, it gave him a platform to basically share with the world. And he loved Baltimore City, and Baltimore City loved him back. I tell people, I couldn't send him, if I forgot something, I was cooking, I forgot something, I couldn't send him to the store to go get it, because I wouldn't see him for hours. Because, you know, he would inevitably go into the grocery store, and he would have a line of people lined up to talk to him about whatever they wanted to talk about. And it was always, hey, Elijah, you know, it wasn't like, hey, Congressman Cummings, it was Elijah. We know him. He's of us. We're of him. We love you.
Oh, wow. Wonderfully put. You know, thank you again, Dr. Maya Rockeymoore Cummings and James Dell, for this wonderful discussion. You know, Fulton Public Library System is honored by this beautiful virtual program and collaboration. You know, tonight's discussion is also followed by Fulton Public Library's Black Poetry Fest at 7, which is a virtual program. In celebration of Black History Month, the library system is providing a range of virtual programs highlighting and celebrating Black history, culture, literature, and excellence. And you can also browse Fulton Public Library System's official library website and catalog for We're Better Than This by Elijah Cummings, Dr. Maya Rockeymoore Cummings, and James Dell. We thank you again for attending tonight's discussion, and have a blessed and safe evening.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you so much for having us.
Oh, thank you.